Hello and welcome to today's FP virtual dialogue on the topic of securing our digital future. My name is Ravi Agrawal, Editor-in-Chief of Foreign Policy Magazine, and it's my pleasure to be your host this morning for the next 70 minutes or so, I should say. Now, today's program serves as a launch pad for a new special report titled Securing Our Digital Future. It's produced by FP Analytics, Foreign Policy's research division, in partnership with Microsoft. And we have a great lineup of guest speakers, including the president of Microsoft, top representatives from the UN, ICRC, and America's top federal cybersecurity agency. You won't want to miss it. Now, as the world continues to rapidly digitize, new vulnerabilities are manifesting across cyberspace, which not only pose risks to individuals and businesses, but also can have potentially devastating impacts on economies and communities at large. In the wake of recent high-profile cyber attacks, experts have been advocating for new multilateral approaches and norms around cybersecurity to safeguard our digital ecosystem. Our report offers a first-of-its-kind overview and insights into the dangers posed by rising cyber threats from state as well as non-state actors, the cost of inaction, and recommendations for addressing these and other challenges. We'll hear more of those insights today as we bring together some of the leading thinkers and doers in this area. On my end, thank you for tuning in. And a big thanks to Microsoft for their partnership in bringing this issue to the fore. Now, before we get started and before I bring in our guests, a few quick housekeeping notes, as we often do in this virtual world. If you're tuned in via our live event page and ever experience any audio or video problems first, try hitting the refresh button. That usually fixes everything. If it doesn't, go to foreignpolicy.com/live to watch the live stream directly. But we encourage you to stay tuned in right here because we've reserved a portion of this event for questions from you, our global audience. And here's how you can write us. For those of you who are logged in on our event webpage at foreignpolicy.com/events, please remember to submit your questions via the question box next to the video player on your screen. We'll try to include as many audience questions as possible. I can see some coming in already during all of these live sessions. If you're on social media, chime in on the conversation using the hashtag Global Cyber Cooperation. Let's make sure this conversation is heard far and wide, and make sure you tell us your name, your organization, and where you're writing in from. It's always nice to see people from different countries engaging with this very global issue. Okay, so let's get started. I'm delighted now to start the program with our first guest, Brad Smith, president of Microsoft. Brad plays a key role in spearheading Microsoft's work on critical issues involving the intersection of technology and society, which covers a broad spectrum, including cybersecurity, privacy, AI, environmental sustainability, human rights, immigration, and philanthropy. Brad, welcome.
Well, thank you, and thank you, I think, for the terrific work by FP Analytics. It's been a real pleasure and privilege for us to be part of this, and I had the chance to spend a little time over the weekend reading the publication, Securing Our Digital Future. It's great to have so many voices, and I know those voices are going to be heard in this program as well.
Well, the feeling is very much mutual, Brad, and I found your essay very interesting as well in that report, so I urge everyone to read it. But that brings me to our conversation now, I guess. And I thought maybe it would make the most sense for us to just begin with this. Why do you and why does Microsoft care so much about this space?
Well, obviously, when you think about our digital future, that is our business in part. If you think about the role that Microsoft plays in the world today, the role of a number of other big tech companies, we own, we operate, we build, we need to secure the infrastructure, the public cloud, and the other applications that are at the heart of people's lives, their businesses, their operations. And we've seen the past year really unfold in an extraordinary way. Almost all of the issues that we're here to talk about today have become even more important. The situation, I think, has become even more challenging.
Indeed, it has. So since you talked about the last year, let's address that. So the Solarwinds hack in particular, talk us through a little bit about how that happened, what it was like, and what that meant for you in terms of your work, and how it sort of focused the mind on the importance of cybersecurity.
Well, I think the attack really shined a light on a number of things that are important to reflect upon. I mean, one was just the, frankly, extraordinary persistence, sophistication, and scale of that attack. The number of large government and other organizations around the world that were impacted by it. It was an extraordinary time for us at Microsoft in terms of really requiring, as we've said, moving about 500 engineers full-time, in some cases on a 24/7 basis, to work with our customers, to partner with FireEye and Solarwinds itself to identify who is being attacked, to figure out how to get the attacker out of their network. And then to really think about and talk with the incoming Biden administration, with congressional committees, with governments around the world about the lessons learned and the steps that we need to take to better protect ourselves from that kind of attack.
Indeed, and I want to talk a little bit about the government's role, but before we get to that, in the piece you wrote in this special report, you said that government action alone will not solve the problem. And I was curious what you meant with that in terms of details and the role of the private sector. How can companies work together? What kinds of rules are you envisioning we would need to thwart the rise of cybercrime?
I think there's a few things we need to think about. First, and perhaps foremost, when we're talking about cyberspace, we're really not talking about some ephemeral dimension. We're talking very concretely about data centers, about fiber and cables. We're talking about devices, phones and laptops, servers and the like. Obviously, an awful lot of this is in the hands of the private sector, including tech companies that are responsible for managing this. So I think that always means that at a company like Microsoft, we have the first and foremost responsibility to spend and invest more, do more to secure all of this technology. And that's one of the things we're focused on doing. Second, I think that we need to keep working harder, frankly, to partner more with our customers, whether they're a publication, an organization like yours, whether they're an NGO, whether they're a company, or whether they're a government. We can keep strengthening the security features of our products, but this still will always rely on the decisions that individuals and organizations make to turn on security protection, something like two-factor authentication, to apply best practices, to hire the right kinds of people with the right kind of expertise. And finally, there's the point that you referred to. All of this, in our view, works best when it is subject to rules and norms and international law. And we need to strengthen the laws and norms that exist today. We need to fill in some gaps where we see them. And I think some of the recent events have shined a light on opportunities for more work in that area as well.
Can I push you a little bit there? So, just give us some examples of some of the gaps you might be seeing in terms of global rules and norms, and how would you like to see those filled?
Well, I would highlight three in particular that I think the pandemic in the last year have highlighted. One is the norm that disruption of the software and hardware supply chain should be off limits for nation state attacks. I think this is well grounded in longstanding international legal principles, going back to the Fourth Geneva Convention, that requires that governments avoid harm to civilians, and more generally that governments avoid acts that can cause indiscriminate harm. And the SolarWinds incident showed that when a country targets the software supply chain, what they in effect did was infect up to 18,000 organizations around the world, so they could then pick and choose which ones they wanted to penetrate further. But it's like disrupting and undermining something like the blood supply. When you do that, everything is at risk. People's confidence in updating is at risk. So that's one. The second I would point to is the protection of elections and democratic processes. That is the third principle of the Paris Call. There's a Paris Call community that we've been part of in partnership with the Canadian government and others to focus more on this. But this emerged as a new problem over the last decade. We need to strengthen that norm. And then finally, I would point to the protection of healthcare providers and the public health system. The International Committee of the Red Cross, Peter Maurer, has been a real leader in, I think, highlighting the need for more action here. We are supporting that at Microsoft. If we could address those three issues, protect people's health, protect democracy, protect the supply chain, we would advance norms in a way that would make a very real difference in people's lives.
Indeed, and we'll be hearing from Peter later this hour. Brad, let me ask you what you would like to see from government. So we've spoken a fair bit about what the private sector needs to do. When you look around at what the public sector is doing, what do you find frustrating about that process? And if you could sort of ask the public sector to focus its minds around one or two things, what would those be?
Well, I think this is a process for all of us. I'm not frustrated actually by any of this, but I am enthusiastic about the opportunity, I think, for us collaboratively to do more. I would ask people in government first to focus on strengthening their own cybersecurity protection. Second, to think about the role that they uniquely play in new laws and regulations and international collaboration among governments. And third, to think about how we can use multi-stakeholder action to bring everyone together. We do need to convene in new places. I think the French government and its program for action had an important proposal that the United Nations consider having a standing body to deal with these cybersecurity issues. But what I think we should remember is that we live in a world where in a body like the United Nations, governments quite properly and uniquely are the ones who have the votes, but we all need to have a voice. We can't solve cybersecurity challenges if the only people who speak are those who also can vote. We need to work together. We need to talk and learn from each other, but most importantly, we need to act in a collaborative way. And we're seeing the path. I think the Paris Call is one place where we've seen that. The Paris Peace Forum in November will be important. We have lots of opportunities to build on recent progress.
Well, there's a clear call to action right there. Brad Smith, thank you very much for your time.
No, thank you.
Brad Smith there, the president of Microsoft. Thanks to him. Thanks again to Microsoft for supporting this project. As we can see, it's a very timely and important issue that demands the global community's attention. Now, to help glean some insights now into the report itself and the data that it uncovered, I am pleased to be joined by my colleague, Alison Carlson, Managing Director of FP Analytics, FP's Research and Advisory Division. Alison and her team have been the driving force behind this fascinating report, and I'm excited we can now spotlight some of its key findings. Hi, Alison.
Hi, Ravi. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Alison, so let me start with this. What were your primary goals of the report and the focus of FPA's research?
Sure. Thanks, Ravi. Well, first, I'd just like to thank Microsoft for the partnership for this project, and to our team and to all of the contributors that made this project happen. Our analytics team, as you know, Ravi, really focuses a lot of our work at the intersection of technology, policy, and geopolitics. And it's been a real pleasure and incredible opportunity to work with Microsoft to elevate awareness of growing cyber threats in the world and what's at stake and the steps that can be taken for more collaborative action in this space. So really appreciate this opportunity. I wanted to thank them again. For our part of the research, our team for the report really dug into the escalation of cyber threats, and particularly the escalation of cyber threats by state actors, and what is really at risk if we don't act to safeguard this space. What we've seen is over the last several years, there's been a real increase, not only in the number of attacks, but the rate of those attacks by state-sponsored bodies. So around 2005, which is a little bit earlier than the graphic you're seeing on your screen now. But since 2005, we've seen a real steady escalation. And since that time, about 35 countries are suspected of sponsoring over 500 cyber operations. And really a number of factors are contributing to that, including evolving cyber capabilities, declining costs that are really lowering the barriers to entry, that are making digital weapons not only increasingly accessible, but also powerful tools for both state and non-state actors. And over the same time period, there's been this rapid expansion of data-driven technologies everywhere and our increasing dependence on them. The COVID-19 pandemic really bore that out. And what's happened in that concurrent growth and that expansion is the attack surface that is available. And all of that requires more agile defenses.
So Alison, it's clear that the number of attacks are increasing rapidly, but are you detecting any changes in terms of the types of each of these attacks?
Yeah, absolutely. What we've seen and what we're all experiencing online are widespread mis and disinformation campaigns in particular. But what we've seen and through our research with respect to state-sponsored attacks is that the majority of those, and you can see a bit of a breakdown here on your screen, are really through data extortion, attacks using ransomware, intellectual property theft, and a rise in surveillance. Looking at the data, about over 3/4 of the attributed state-sponsored attacks in 2020, for example, were acts of espionage. And in the last year alone, we've seen that. And in the course of the pandemic, we've learned of intelligence gathering attacks really focused on acquiring IP related to vaccines. And those attacks have been linked to China, Russia, North Korea. And we can expect those types of attacks to continue.
Now, despite all of us being online, sometimes it's hard to see how these risks can impact our lives. What are you seeing in terms of risks to human security, and why is this so urgent?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We've certainly seen the rise in surveillance and acquisition of surveillance technologies by governments, and that poses real risks to human rights. But we've also seen increasing attacks on critical infrastructure as well. Certainly in the news, there have been quite a few reports of attacks on water treatment facilities, pipelines, meatpacking plants, and those have real disruptive impacts on supply chains, as Brad was noting, impacting businesses, consumers, but also our safety. As part of this report, and to get a sense of the potential impact of attacks on critical infrastructure, our team looked at power plants, right? Power plants are critical to all of our lives, the operation of our economies, and what could happen with attacks on those facilities. And so we broke down power infrastructure across different countries, and given the concentration of power and energy generation, an attack on one facility or a network of facilities could have extensive impacts on populations, their economies, and also have really cascading impacts for safety and security. And so I would invite everyone to dig down into the data and look at the report. But I think all of those risks sort of bring to bear the importance of international collaboration in this space and the need to safeguard this infrastructure. And it's not only the infrastructure that we have, but it's the infrastructure that's being developed. In the next decade or so, billions of people who are not even yet connected to the internet will be coming online. And it's really important that we safeguard this infrastructure and the economic opportunities and advancement that's associated with that. And so I think it's just this incredible call to action for cross-border collaboration in this space and really safeguarding the opportunity that we have before us and that future. And so it's been incredible to work on this project and everyone who's been involved in it. And again, thank you to all of the contributors and to Microsoft and to all of you who are working day in and day out, to really address these issues and solve these problems. We have several folks with us here today on the event and on the call, and who have contributed to the report. So thank you all again, and would invite all of you in our audience to check out the report as well, and that's online.
Alison, thank you so much for that. As she said, take a look at the report online. You can find the link through foreignpolicy.com. Thanks very much, Alison. Now, we've truly just scratched the surface here, but it's clear that these cyber threats are already having real-world social and economic implications, and that the cost of inaction may have potentially devastating implications. I encourage everyone to check out and share the report. Again, securingourdigitalfuture.com. You can find a link through on foreignpolicy.com as well. Lots of stuff in there to take a look at, as Alison was pointing out. Now, let's take a closer look at how the public sector is grappling with these issues. We discussed the private sector with Brad Smith. Time now for the other side of that equation. I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker. Eric Goldstein serves as the Executive Assistant Director for Cybersecurity for the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA. In this role, he leads CISA's mission to protect and strengthen federal civilian agencies and the nation's critical infrastructure against cyber threats. Eric, welcome.
Thanks so much, Rob. It's great to be here.
Great to have you with us. Okay, so let's start with this. What is the public sector's role in preventing cyber attacks?
Thanks so much for that question. And also thanks so much for all the great work that went into the report reference. It really is foundational work to move forward the dialogue in this key area. You know, cybersecurity really intrinsically is a partnership. We know that there is no one organization that can handle the burden of securing our critical infrastructure against cyber threats. Similarly, there is no sector, public or private, that can handle this mission alone. So the role of the public sector really is twofold. First of all, to make sure that our own house is in order, that the federal agencies, the government services upon which the American people, and of course, internationally, citizens of nations around the world depend, is secure and resilient against cyber threats. And the second is partnering with the private sector to ensure that we are building a community of practice and of expertise where we are rapidly sharing information, sharing guidance, adopting best practices, and ensuring that we are building a cybersecurity environment that is more secure by design. That work intrinsically must be a partnership between the government, which has unique information, unique levers to drive change, and the private sector, which of course builds, operates, and manages the vast majority of technology that we all use for our daily lives.
Talk us through specific measures that CISA, your organization, is taking to protect critical infrastructure such as power grids and pipelines.
Absolutely. There's really three that I'll call out. The first is making sure that all organizations have the information they need to secure their own networks, and really being that trusted voice for the cybersecurity community to amplify best practices and share information about significant cybersecurity risks. As one example, I'll call out our fairly new whole of government resource, stopransomware.gov, which is a single place where organizations can go to identify information on how to reduce the likelihood and impact of and respond and report ransomware intrusion. So that first role is ensuring that every organization can access the information needed to secure their networks. The second role is serving as a hub for operational collaboration and information sharing. This can be work like identifying intrusions, deriving technical information that is useful to stop similar attacks, and then sharing that information out broadly. And in this category, I will note that just yesterday, we released, along with our colleagues at the FBI and National Security Agency, an advisory on Conti ransomware that builds from our knowledge of Conti ransomware intrusions globally, and also bringing together partners to work through what we call operational collaboration, which is identifying specific cybersecurity risks, bringing together experts from government and the private sector, and then taking joint action to reduce risks over time. And the third category is providing actual services, tools, and capabilities to help improve organization security programs. So in this regard, we provide services like threat hunting, like vulnerability assessments, like architecture reviews, so that organizations that want an additive boost to their security programs can rely upon the unique expertise that CISA provides to ensure that they are able to build a security program of the depth and maturity needed to meet the risks that they're facing.
I'd like to bring in a couple of our questions coming in from our global audience. One of these, I think, is a great jumping point for us here. It's from Moriah, who works for NASA. She's in Nashville. And her question is, how do federal agencies involved in science keep up or match pace with the breakneck speed of technological advancements that allow for security breaches? Eric?
Great question. And thank you for your work at NASA. They're a key partner to CISA, and of course, one of the most critical agencies in the US government for our cybersecurity mission. There's really two answers there. The first answer is that we know that even though our adversaries are adapting quickly and are investing in sophisticated types of intrusions, tactics, techniques, and procedures, we also know that many intrusions today are still exploiting known vulnerabilities, known security weaknesses. They're exploiting lack of multi-factor authentication or unpatched devices that are facing the internet. And so, we still know that even given, as the question notes, the accelerating pace of sophistication of cyber intrusions, really investing in a lot of these core cybersecurity practices remain demonstrably effective in reducing cybersecurity risks. But we also know that given this increasing pace of sophistication, all organizations are not going to prevent every intrusion every time. And so we need to focus on moving towards what we call in the field zero trust principles, in which we focus on identifying the accounts and the technology assets most consequential to the organization and strictly limiting access to accounts, to assets, to data, so that even if an intruder makes it through the perimeter, is able to compromise an organization, their ability to move across the environment, access information, and steal information or cause harm is limited strictly. CISA and our colleagues recently released a new zero trust maturity model, which is available on our website, cisa.gov. It's actually out for public comment now. And we hope that work like this will help organizations move to this sort of zero trust model, where even when a breach occurs, the impact thereof is far more limited than it is today.
How can governments and other stakeholders effectively craft enforcement mechanisms for cyber norms? We often talk about rules. So, how do you craft them and how do you enforce them?
It is certainly remains a challenge both to enforce cyber norms and also to enforce cybersecurity best practices. I'll take the second first, which is to note that one area of real focus at CISA is to frame cybersecurity investment as a business proposition to help organizations understand that cybersecurity is not a cost center. It is on the one hand an obligation and also potentially a market differentiator. So that organizations that have better cybersecurity are both maintaining the trust of their clients, customers, and partners, and are also differentiating themselves in the market from those that are investing less. And we hope that this sort of a mindset will help organizations make the right investments in cybersecurity. Certainly, as your question notes, cybersecurity is a global challenge. And where there are actors on the global stage that either enable, support, or sponsor malicious cyber activity that undermines the security of all of us, which is why this really needs to be a global effort where like-minded countries come together and offer a clear and strong view on appropriate behavior in cyberspace so we can continue making progress towards a free, open, and secure internet where all of our countries can thrive.
Let me ask you this. I mean, given SolarWinds, given other sort of instances of cyber attacks, what has CISA learned in the last year or 2 years, not just from specific attacks, but also from the global increase in cyber attacks?
It's a great question. I think we've learned a couple of things that I'll particularly call out. The first is that we really need to expand what I'll call the parameters of the cybersecurity challenge. And what I mean by that is traditionally or historically, most organizations really focused on their own network, their own enterprise. And what we've learned from intrusions like SolarWinds is we need to think far more broadly, because we now know, given the interconnected nature of our network technologies, a compromise at a third or fourth or fifth party service provider can cascade through the ecosystem and cause significant impacts and enable intrusions where the victim organizations really had never even conceived of a trust relationship being exploited to that degree. This is why President Biden issued a cybersecurity executive order earlier in this year, which included a real focus on securing the software supply chain, focusing on software assurance, and adopting practices like software bill of materials, where we focus on understanding the elements of software and hardware on our networks and managing risks therein. I think the second piece is really further building on collaboration between government and the private sector. Back to your first question, we know with the SolarWinds campaign, as with almost all major campaigns we've seen, the victims were not only governmental or private sector, but in fact were cross-cutting and often global in nature. To this end, CISO recently established a new initiative called the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, which is our new model to really bring together those private companies that can drive change at scale, those US government and international partners with the ability to gain unique visibility into cybersecurity risks, and then come together to plan, exercise, and execute joint cyber defense activities that we think will materially reduce risks.
Eric Goldstein, thank you for your thoughts and for taking all of those questions from me. Eric Goldstein there, he is the Executive Assistant Director for Cybersecurity at CISA. Eric, thanks.
Thank you, Robbie. Have a great day.
You too. Okay, lots more to come in this program still. Remember, you can ask your questions. We're getting a few more in. I promise to take more of them in our next segment. But it's easy to type them in on the question box right next to the screen you are watching this on. You can also write us at any time at events@foreignpolicy.com. Okay, let's take a look now at what is being done and what needs to be done on a multilateral, multi-stakeholder level, given the transboundary and cross-cutting nature of all of these cyber threats. So we've looked at public sector, we've looked at private sector. Now it's time to look at how all of this sort of matches up together. So our next segment features an impressive group of leaders working on these evolving cyber issues and how we might guard against current and future cybersecurity threats. So I'll introduce them all now. Stephane Dugue, he's the CEO of the Cyber Peace Institute. Stephane's work focuses on how technology can be weaponized against vulnerable communities. In particular, he's investigated multiple instances of the use of disruptive technologies such as AI in the context of counterterrorism, cybercrime, hybrid threats, and the online use of disinformation techniques. Modiehi Makumani is the non-resident consultant on cyber issues, security, and technology unit at the UN Institute for Disarmament Research. Modiehi is a cyber diplomat committed to a multi-stakeholder approach to promote development, peace, and security. She advocates for developing countries' perspectives and contributions to cyber global governance. And Peter Mora, you heard about him earlier. He's the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross. As head of the ICRC, Peter works on the humanitarian consequences resulting from cyber threats, such as the spread of disinformation and hate speech, cyber attacks on healthcare facilities, or data protection in humanitarian contexts. Welcome to all of you, Stephane, Modiehi, and Peter. Great to have you on board.
Thank you, Ravi.
All right, excellent. Well, Peter, why don't I bring you in first? And let me ask you this. How are cyber threats, given your work around the world with the ICRC, how are cyber threats different from other major security challenges? And why is government alone insufficient to address these threats?
What we see at the front lines of humanitarian work is, of course, that when we move from kinetic to cyber, we move from visible to invisible. And I think that's what makes populations so vulnerable. What puts us in front of so important dilemmas in our work is that the digital transformation gives us possibilities to assist and protect people which we didn't have before. It allows us to reconnect families, to identify needs, to get in contact with beneficiaries. And this is all data-driven, which makes at the same time that those populations we assist are at the same time vulnerable to attack. And I think that's the new situation in which we find ourselves. If we look at the whole value chain of delivering assistance and protection services to people, we see that we can do better and we have huge opportunities. And at the same time, data security becomes a real threat. We are already operating in the most vulnerable contexts of the world where mistrust, misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech in the real kinetic world have been drivers of conflict and violence. And we have seen the dynamics when we just look back, for instance, 30 years in the genocide in Rwanda or in the Balkans, what misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech through radio has done. Today, we are in a new quality of vulnerability, which we find ourselves, and therefore in pointed dilemmas. And I wanted to echo what Brad had said at the beginning. This, of course, focuses then our attention on the normative systems we can develop, on the diplomacy we can engage with states and private actors in order to see how we can protect those populations and institutions who work at front lines of conflicts and vulnerabilities. And here, I think, is the most interesting thing with regard to how we interpret and develop the normative system of the Geneva Conventions, which has been designed for kinetic warfare and the protection of civilian in kinetic war, and which needs interpretation and further development as we see vulnerabilities develop in the more invisible and untouchable areas of our work.
Modyehi, let me bring you in. Given your work, and we've talked a fair bit about the public sector and the private sector, what's the role of other stakeholders in ensuring cybersecurity?
Thank you, Ravi. I think the issue of roles is one that everyone is grappling with. The role of countries themselves has come under sharp attention to not only meet these new challenges, but to also fulfill and remain committed to the existing ones. And one of the challenges is that we're having all these conversations, I think, in the same multilateral system, the same international system that we've always had, that from my perspective still has the same challenges of mandate creep and forum shopping. And I mean, in my experience, for instance, during the open-ended working group, whenever an issue around the cybercrime part of the problem would come up, we very quickly want to revert to the fact that there are other competent bodies that exist. And so we shift it and not really give enough attention to try and get a bigger, more comprehensive understanding of the problem. And that hampers a lot of smaller countries to really understand what the issue is. And as a result of that, the role that other multi-stakeholder entities have to play, we are sort of playing it by ear, and it's not always very clear for smaller developing countries exactly how that is going to happen. But another thing I also want to add, Ravi, is also that as much as the issue is so big and everyone has their eyes on it, not every country has a bias to cyber antagonism in this space. The cybersecurity issues that we're having at the multilateral level are happening, yes, but not at the same level that is happening in certain parts of the world. It's just another issue that hasn't replaced existing global governance issues, and in some respects has also amplified them. So we need to start thinking around designing new ways of cooperating and new ways of looking at the issues without these mandate creep or these platform shopping type of problems that I think we have and will continue to have until we make a decision to make a change.
Indeed. Let me bring in Stephane as well. You know, in talking about cyber crime and cyber war, it's interesting how many war terminologies we've begun to bring into the cyber world. For example, mercenaries, you know, and states increasingly use cyber mercenaries to project power through cyberspace. So Stephane, what is the role of private sector offensive actors? And given the work you do, what needs to be done to address them?
And thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to participate at this to this joint venture. If I can just rebound on your question before providing an answer to the terminology. So it feels to me sometimes that in the cyber realm there's a lot of false representation, if not misunderstanding, into what is what. And your question points to that. Is first there's this, whole idea of and why it's very difficult for a lot of entities, vulnerable communities to scale up resilience or security, is thinking that cyberspace is something very virtual when it's not at the end of the day. I mean, when we see the beneficiaries that we, Cyber Peace Institute, service, so we are an NGO, non-for-profit, and we service NGOs to their cyber need, they are in the business of access to food, access to water, access to microfinancing, in the pandemic, access to healthcare. And this is what cybersecurity is about, something very tangible and practical. And the second misunderstanding, and it's linked to your question, is this illusion that attackers, they are very young, wearing a hoodie, hiding in their cave behind a keyboard. Doesn't work like this. I mean, we have a constellation of actors, so organized crime groups, clearly more and more sophisticated, working together a lot, and we saw that in the ransomware context, for example. State actors, very importantly, or by the fact that they are organizing attacks, or that they are organizing the fact that criminal groups can operate without any prosecution or any cost to the activities that they are doing. And then you have, to your point, this ecosystem that is growing. It's a market, it's a business market, it's there upfront, which is about developing tools in order to organize mass surveillance or very targeted invasion to privacy, leading to violation of human rights. So these companies, and there was a scandal not so long ago with the Pegasus malware, this company is specialized into providing tools to states or others. So you have a private sector that suddenly decides who can listen to whom, so who is going to violate whom human rights, and due diligence are close to zero. There's little regulation around this and absolutely no, I would say, public oversight. I mean, this equation, when you have a capacity in a state to be very strong and accurate in surveillance, there should be the same capacity to people to be in power, empowered to monitor and surveil what the states are doing. So requesting accountability to the methodology and making sure that when there's surveillance, it's according to the law. So we have this business model that is prevalent now. And in fact, it's a part of the private sector that is not so well known, but has a systemic impact to any ambition of peace in cyberspace.
Odiehi, let me bring you back in. I'm curious about what we can do. I'm in New York, and I often find that these conversations take center stage in, big cities in the West. But how do we bring emerging economies along to increase resilience and ensure that they are part of this multilateral approach? I think Alison mentioned this earlier, but half the world is still offline. Most of that world is in the developing world. You look at countries like India or Bangladesh or Pakistan, many countries across Africa. That's where the new digital next couple of billion are going to come from. So what are the steps you think the world needs to take to increase resilience in those parts of the world against cyber crime, cyber warfare, and other harms on the cyber world?
Thank you, Ravi. And I'll just piggyback on what you said about the digital. I think one way in which we can start is by also shifting the narrative. They are emerging economies, yes, but something that they also have in common is also that they are newly digitizing countries, which means that they are building their digital infrastructure, transitioning to digital economies, and like you said, bringing more people online. But this, in the multilateral side, is just one facet of what these countries bring to the table. You look at the amount of investment that smaller countries put just to bid for a Security Council non-permanent seat. That is commitment to peace and security. And so in this digital space where we're talking about digital peace and securing our common future, one thing that we also have to keep in mind is that the world is going to have to give these countries some time. In my role as a representative, one of the things that I did a lot was to buy policy space. And that is something that we're going to have to contend with. You are bringing on a lot more voices to support the vote. And not all of them are going to agree with how the world is deciding to address this issue right now. And that has to go hand in hand with the capacity building. And that is something that I think is very important, but we also need to make sure that everyone is on the same page with what capacity building means in this respect. It's not just a north-south type of capacity building we're talking about, but also leveraging on the south-south relations between those newly digitizing economies. And I think those processes need to move parallel. But the other thing is also these newly digitizing economies also prefer multilateral systems. And so as different initiatives are also taking place outside of the UN, it's also prudent for us to also find a way back into the UN, which is where a lot of their capacity is also targeted and where a lot of their capacity also exists. I can't be in 50 different meetings in 3 different cities, New York, Geneva, Vienna. That's challenging for a small country. And so we need to also find a way to centralize the conversation and not make it too decentralized that we do leave these countries out.
Right. I want to bring in some of the questions we're getting in from our global audience. And what I'm going to do for our panelists, I'm going to name check a few of these questions, read out a few of them. And as I come to you, feel free to sort of try and answer whichever one of those you can, or work them into the answers that you are giving us. Hanfu Mi at UIS from Springfield, Illinois, asks, what are some of the main factors impeding global cyber cooperation? Zviad Zinbaya at the Fletcher School at Tufts asks, to what level do you partner with transatlantic allies, NATO, EU, on critical infrastructure defense and election integrity? Is it sufficient? Mark Toledo, who's a postgraduate researcher at Imperial in London, asks, as cyber attacks become more systematic and sophisticated with AI gaining relevance, what are some of the next steps that public and private organizations should take to better tackle AI-led attacks? And then lastly, Richard Bisk, this one is specifically to Peter Maurer, so we'll pick up with Peter after this. What kind of deliverables do you see the Red Cross providing for cybersecurity? So just a sampling there of some of the questions we're getting in. Peter, why don't I bring you in? We have about 10 minutes left on this panel. So I'll give you a couple of minutes to try and address the question directly at you, and also if you want to touch on any of the others. but quick
I
answers,
think indeed the deliverable and the obstacle question are intrinsically linked. And when I listen to the previous discussion, one of the obstacles remains that we always think the challenges in state-based system. If we develop norm, we consider them in state-based system. We consider them in the framework of the UN. And earlier in the conversation, I think somebody has alluded to communities of practice. And I think what lacks today and what is an obstacle to development is that we insufficiently link community of practices with the legitimate and legitimacy advantages that the state-based system has. When I look at obstacles also, I feel very strongly that we are in a competitive environment and that those states who have competitive advantages are not ready at the present moment to get even into a negotiation on normative systems which would restrict in any way their possibilities to further gain competitive advantage. What are deliverables? My sense is, and that's the interest of what we bring in, I think, as a guardian of the Geneva Conventions, is that we have time-tested principles and norms which have developed over centuries in order to address, at that time, kinetic security challenges. And I think one of what we can realistically expect is that the next generation of lawmakers in the international and multilateral arena think about how these principles, which have been there for hundreds of years, resonate and how they apply and how they need to be applied. That's the reason why the ICRC convenes really lawyers and practitioners on cybersecurity to see how do we think about these principles in the future. What is the meaning of proportionality, precaution, distinction? What is the battlefield in the future? Can we work towards consensus in the international community around some of the basic notions which have been consensual in the kinetic world and interpret them in a way that they become more consensual in the cyber world? And I think this is the big deliverable that we are working at the ICRC and on which we need those community-based, multi-stakeholder inputs, which eventually allow us to develop norms on a consensual basis, which might be an orientation for future behaviors. Mm-hmm. Brad has mentioned sensitive critical infrastructure, hospital infrastructure. These are issues which are consensual in the international community when it comes to the kinetic world and which on which we need to build consensus in the cyber security world.
Sure. You know, on the issue of the kinetic world, the real world, however we want to call it, I just wanted to flag a question from Andrew Updegrove of Gesmer Updegrove LLP. And his question, I'll just read it out very quickly, and then after that we can go to Stephane. His question is, the degree of focus on cyber defense to the exclusion of kinetic attack risk leaves a real concern uncovered. For example, all data farms in the EU are both unprotected and within range of Russian cruise missiles. A single attack wave in the middle of winter would leave Europe with no way to transport food or fuel or any way to rebuild these facilities. It would also likely wipe out, he says, all backup copies of the data destroyed. The same risk exists in the US, where data farms cluster together and are vulnerable to seaborne attack. Why is there no plan to avoid such a crippling attack? Let me bring in Stephane. Stephane, wondering if you have an answer either to the question just posed or any of the other earlier ones from Hanfumi, Zviad Adzvinbaya, and Mark Toledo.
No, thank you. I will try to put everything into one answer. If you look at what is making cyber solution across the globe effective, having read SCORE, the problematic of cyber cooperation, I think what we saw in the Cyber Peace Institute is that solutions too often are not looking into the societal impact, the human impact of the attacks. Attacks are still too often described in infrastructure costs or in money cost, but we don't look what is into the human cost of the attack. All the practical solution in the institute that we delivered have the human at the center. And I give you a practical example, and there was a question on what can we do practically, is we put together a program called the Cyber Peace Builders, where we, Cyber Peace Institute, provide for free support to NGOs. NGOs, I was mentioning it before, that are the closest of the vulnerable communities. So the one in need today in multiple crises to access food, water, education, microfinance, knowledge, you name it. And these are the ones the most impacted by large-scale attack at the time of war, at the time of peace. So what we do in order to scale the response, and you're mentioning several times, what is the role of the private sector, we make sure that the capable and the willing in the private sector gets an opportunity to participate to projects, to have hands-on practical support to these entities. Before an incident, sadly enough, after an incident, but for the whole community to be more resilient. So you have capacity in the private sector, but sometimes you don't have the idea on how to use this capacity at best for the community, and we provide this very practical platform. There was a question about artificial intelligence. Just 2 words on this one. It's a problem because today, you know, this equation about attackers and defenders in the cyberspace is that attackers has just to be right one time, when defenders needs to be right 100% of the time. And because of AI, this equation is getting quite imbalanced because it multiplies the capacity for attackers to try again to penetrate the system until the moment they are going to be in. So it's quite a threat. And I will finish with something else that is AI related, is today we have split discussion between the groups that are looking into the cyber realm, like Open-Ended Working Group or the GGE, and groups that are looking into autonomous weapon. But an autonomous weapon, at the end of the day, is just a piece of code, a piece of cyber code with metal around it. And in order to have, you know, some consistent policy and consistent approaches, it would be good that groups comes together and to look into the challenges of the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephane. Let's bring in Modiehi for the last word here. And Modiehi, I'll put a question from Paul Meyer, another one of our viewers. He's in Vancouver, Canada, works for ICT for Peace. And his question is, what can be done to establish a standing UN body with responsibility for cybersecurity and to introduce a peer review mechanism to hold states to account for their cyber conduct? So his question is essentially about the enforcement of rules. What do you have to say?
I will say it will take a while, a really long time, but that's because I don't see UN member states ceding that much power to a peer review type of mechanism, because in this situation, who gets to underwrite what is right and what is wrong, unless we can all agree on a more formal and legal framework. What we have are norms of responsible state behavior, which is consensus-driven, yes, but which is just a normative foundation. And in that respect, I think the word accountability is a very tricky one, and it's too soon to start talking about that because not everyone is around the mahogany table, as they sometimes call it. And we still have a while to go to figure out exactly what the rules of the road are. What I think we have now is a window of opportunity to bring everyone who needs to be part of this conversation to the table, including the non-state actors, in a more formalized way, and to also start thinking about the impacts of societies by operationalizing and starting to change the narrative around how we achieve consensus development goals, as well as protect the cyberspace at the same time.
Modiehi Makumani, thank you so much for that answer and for your time. I'm going to wrap this panel up now. So Modiehi Makumani, United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. Thanks also to Stephane Dugue, the CEO of CyberPeace, and Peter Moore of the ICRC. Thank you to each of you.
Thank you.
Pleasure to have you all on. Now, on to the concluding segment of today's program. I had the pleasure to sit down earlier this week with Izumi Nakamitsu, the Undersecretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs at the UN. She unfortunately wasn't able to join us today, but we had the opportunity to connect ahead of time to learn more about the UN's efforts in the face of advancing digital technologies, cyber threats, and the added threat of the malicious use of all of these new technologies that we've been talking about. I began by asking Izumi how worried she is about the potential for conflict, all-out conflict in cyberspace. Listen in.
Well, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who are worried, myself included, the Secretary General, of course, included in that category of people. And I think there have been increased awareness and recognition of the need to be better prepared and the risks to international peace and security involving emerging domains of potential conflict, such as cyberspace, are definitely growing. I think states are increasingly concerned over potential cyber attacks, including by, of course, non-state actors, terrorist and criminal groups, and they are taking actions accordingly. And I think in recent decades, incidents involving the malicious use of information and communication technologies, ICTs, by state and non-state actors have increased in scope, scale, sophistication, and of course, severity as well. So I think there is a clear evidence that the range of actors, including states, are using ICTs and other cyber technologies in a manner that undermines trust and increases the risks for traditional armed conflict. It must be, therefore, underscored that militarization of digital space is also a concern, as more states incorporate cyber operations into their military strategies and concepts. So if you put all these things together, we are, of course, concerned.
Talk us through a little bit about, the solutions. So from your perch at the United Nations, how are you able to, in a very multilateral way, create norms and rules of the road for countries to responsibly use information and communications technologies and also to enforce those rules?
Right. So, these discussions actually have been taking place at the UN multilateral platform for the past 16 years or so. Now, at the UN, multilateral efforts within the field of disarmament and non-proliferation have traditionally actually focused largely on the regulation of prohibition of specific weapons, as you mentioned in the beginning. But multilateral discussions in the area of cyber and ICTs have concentrated on the behavior of states, including enhancing international cooperation in this area. So there have been some difference in the approach. Now, as an outcome of those intergovernmental processes, discussions, the UN General Assembly has called on all countries to be guided in the use of ICTs by a set of voluntary, non-binding norms of responsible state behavior, as well as concrete set of confidence building and capacity building measures. Governments have also reaffirmed that international law, in particular, the Charter of the United Nations, is applicable and indeed essential to maintaining peace, security, and stability in the overall ICT environment.
How do you enforce them? So, how do you ensure that malactors aren't acting with impunity?
Right. Let me get to that. I think, work undertaken in the relevant UN multilateral bodies has yielded an initial framework, right, for the pursuit of peaceful ICTs environment. Now, the previous intergovernmental groups have also agreed to a set of voluntary norms. And I think altogether, there is a solid basis for promoting peaceful use of the ICT and cyber domain. Now, there is a new process that was just established for the period 2021 and continues until 2025. But clearly more must be done to ensure that cyberspace remains safe and accessible. So we hope that this new process established for the next phase will be a potential, constructive platform for dialogue on the implementation, as you say, of the existing norms, and of course, the possible elaboration of new ones, as well as, of course, related capacity building. Without capacity, across countries, we would not be able to actually implement the existing norms. So it is important to emphasize also, and in my view in particular, that beyond governments, broad stakeholder engagement is required, given the cross-cutting nature, if you will, of the issue that we're talking about. Governments will benefit greatly from the expertise, knowledge, and experience also of representatives from the civil society, the private sector, academia, and also, very importantly, technical community. And many excellent private sector-led cyber initiatives have been established. And of course, you know them all. The Cybersecurity Tech Accord led by Microsoft, just as an example. 2018 Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace also brought together industry, state, civil society, and academia in a commitment of 9 principles for cybersecurity. And these principles cover a range of issues, from developing ways to prevent the proliferation of malicious tools and practices to the promotion and operationalization of international norms for responsible behavior. I also want to emphasize particularly that across all stakeholder groups, the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in norm setting and decision-making process is absolutely crucial to achieve effective and sustainable outcomes. And I think this has to include recognizing the gendered impact, if you will, of digital technologies, AI, cybersecurity incidents, and accordingly devising policy responses. So we must all work together to promote a peaceful cyberspace and implement the norms that we have been establishing. So it's a mixture of various actions altogether. That's why it is a little bit complicated. And elaborating and implementing norms, rules, and principles requires, I really believe, sustained institutional dialogue that is very much inclusive and transparent and held all together between governmental and non-governmental actors as well.
You've mentioned a lot of the ways in which countries can work together. You brought up the private sector as well. I want to push you a little bit more again in terms of how all of the things you've mentioned can be enforced. But as I do that, I also want to ask you, as a final thought and question, what are the main barriers you face to sort of overcome and ensure cybersecurity? And does that keep you up at night?
Well, I mean, the barriers are, several. I mean, for one, I think this is still relatively a new issue. We are still learning as we, discuss those issues. At the first multi-stakeholder meeting that we facilitated in 2019, I think, there were continuous learning exchanges between governmental representatives and non-governmental, industry and academia, civil society representatives. And of course, another barrier, the obstacle, if you will, is that all these malicious activities, which as I mentioned, are very difficult to attribute, technologically also complicated. These are taking place against the background of a deteriorating, if you will, geopolitical environment, international peace and security, stability, atmosphere in the multilateral setting is increasingly difficult. And when those new challenges are happening against the background of such a difficult environment, it gets more difficult to seek solutions. But UN will definitely continue to support governments and work with all these stakeholders that I've mentioned, including civil society and industry, and really want to support implementation of norms that advance responsible state behavior in this domain. And I think the implementation of confidence building measures and international cooperation also to build national capacities. As I mentioned, capacity is key. And it's one of the difficulties, challenges, or barriers, as you put it, in implementing those or enforcing those norms. So we need to also make sure that there is a stronger cooperation to build national capacities, which can really help states to develop means to detect, attribute, and also respond to incidents, and helping to ensure states abide by those agreed norms. So there are definitely lots of work, difficult challenges ahead of us. But I'm certain that if we put our heads together and work together, we will be able to achieve a peaceful and a stable cyber environment.
Let's hope so. Izumi Nakamitsu, pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you very much.
Izumi Nakamitsu there, the Undersecretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs at the United Nations. Okay, unfortunately, we have to leave it right there. This truly has been a fascinating conversation. I learned a lot, and clearly there's so much more to explore on this front. So we'll be paying close attention to the evolving landscape of cyber threats and cybersecurity. To all our speakers, it's been my pleasure to engage with you all. Thank you very much for joining us to share your perspectives. A big thanks again to Microsoft for supporting this event and partnering with us to spearhead thought leadership on this crucial issue. Hopefully, our conversation today has done a little part in raising more awareness about how different sectors and stakeholders can get involved to build a more safe and equitable digital future. And thanks to you, our global audience, and for your questions, which I thought were smart. As always, a full recording of this event will be available shortly on FP's event page at foreignpolicy.com/events, so you can rewatch and share it with others. If this conversation piqued your interest and you haven't read the report yet, be sure to check it out. That's at securingourdigitalfuture.com. And there's more to come from FP soon. On October 28, we're hosting a dialogue about the root causes of climate migration. As the impacts of climate change force communities to leave their homes, we examine the role of international development to foster local resilience and help mitigate this urgent aspect of the climate crisis. Stay tuned for updates. You can find out more at foreignpolicy.com/events. Thanks again for tuning in. I'm Ravi Agrawal, the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine. As always, it is our pleasure to host you for these events, and we're always struck by the level of engagement we find from our global audience and your wonderful questions. So thank you for all of those. Thank you for joining us today. Stay tuned for much more. I'm Ravi Agrawal again. Thank you and stay safe.